author today is Miss Ruth Ben-Ghiat. Ms. Ben-Ghiat is a professor of history and Italian studies at New York University. She writes on authoritarian leaders, fascism, and propaganda. A regular contributor to CNN and other news and analysis sites, she appears frequently on radio, podcasts, and television, and is quoted in news stories around the world on threats to democracy and how to counter them. She is joined today by George Conway. Mr. Conway is a Washington Post contributing columnist, is a lawyer, and an advisor to the Lincoln Project Super PAC. And without any further ado, Mr. Conway and Ms. Ben-Ghiat.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Why don't we just start out with Ruth telling us a little bit about her book?
So I'm going to talk for a little while, and then George and I will discuss. So I wrote Strongmen because I felt it was time to look back on 100 years of authoritarian rule, from the age of fascism to military coups to what I call new authoritarianism, our own age, where they come in through elections and then they manipulate elections to stay in office. With the exception of Gaddafi, who's in the book because he's linked to Mussolini and to Berlusconi, I'm covering right-wing authoritarians. And strongmen are a subset of authoritarians. They're heads of state who damage or destroy democracy and use masculinity as a tool of political legitimacy, both with their own people and in their dealings with foreign leaders. And one of the reasons I wrote the book also is because we're living in a period of intense historical revisionism about authoritarian history, from Putin saying that any mention of the Nazi-Soviet pact is illegal in Russia, to the belief enshrined in t-shirts you can buy on Amazon that Pinochet did nothing wrong. And you may have seen recently the Proud Boys marching, and some of them had these t-shirts. And when we Google these leaders, we see their own propaganda, their own newsreels and videos of the crowds cheering them. We don't see what happens to people who didn't want to show up to be props in their spectacles. So I wanted to look with new eyes at these commonplaces about authoritarian rule, kind of draw back the curtain in a way. And this was a project made all the more urgent by the arrival on the political scene of Trump. And Strongmen is the first book to place Trump in historical perspective, in the perspective of a century of authoritarian rule. And I argue that his actions and his rhetoric are legible in this authoritarian frame and not in a democratic one. So already, because of my training, I've been working on fascism for years. Before he was even inaugurated, I had written an op-ed for CNN called "Trump is Following the Authoritarian Playbook," that kind of predicted what he was going to do. And I've always been happy to be wrong, but I haven't been, unfortunately for us, I haven't been very wrong about Trump. So the book looks at three phases of authoritarian governance for each leader I talk about: how they rise, how they rule, and then how they fall. And the core of the book are the chapters on what I call the authoritarian playbook. They're tools of rule. And each one goes over 100 years. So that was hard to write like that, but it allows the reader to see what stays the same and what changes. So I focus on propaganda, on virility, on corruption, and on violence, and on resistance. So how have tools of resistance changed, what stays the same, and a chapter on endings. How do you get rid of them? And that may be the part that's most interesting to people today. And as part of this rethinking, I wanted to call into question the idea that authoritarianism is an efficient political system that's good for business. From the time of Mussolini, who was said to make the trains run on time, this has been a very hard myth to dislodge. And I show that the opposite is true. Time and again, businesses are depleted of assets or seized by the state, from the actions against Jews in the fascist period to when Mobutu was plundering businesses in the Congo, to what Putin and Erdogan are doing today. Generations of talent are also squandered when elites are killed or driven into exile. So in Chile, under Pinochet, 200,000 Chileans had to leave. And the pain of family separation and what happens when nations of exiles take root outside the nation is also a theme that runs through it, up to resistance, because often people in exile can be the ones to resist effectively. It's safer for them to engage in resistance. So from Mussolini to Putin and Trump, all of the strongmen featured in this book engage in what I call personalist rule. And this is a form of governance that concentrates enormous power in one individual whose private, political, and financial needs come to prevail over national ones, both in domestic policy and foreign policy. Loyalty to him and his allies rather than expertise is the main qualification for serving him. And if the leader is under investigation, the resources and time of the party and government are kind of hijacked to take care of his problems, exonerating his person and smearing and punishing those who are out to get him. This may sound familiar. This is the witch hunts, which not just Trump, but Erdogan and Berlusconi have talked about witch hunts against them. And all of them use what's called divide and rule practices to prevent anybody else from getting too much power. And these governments are actually full of chaos and upheaval. And they surround themselves with they make these cocoons composed of sycophants and flatterers and family members. So I have a paragraph on the role of sons-in-law in authoritarian history, from Mussolini, who appointed his son-in-law foreign minister and then had him killed later, to the sons-in-law of Putin, of Orban, of Erdogan, and our own Jared Kushner. So if you work for an authoritarian, it's dangerous to be too competent, too popular, or too honest. Telling him truths he doesn't want to hear. So the aim is not good governance, but making yourself unassailable and persecuting your enemies and profiting off of your public office. And they also humiliate those around them, and they have these revolving door governments, so much hiring and firing. So Fascist Party Secretary Giovanni Girardi found out he was fired in 1931 by reading the newspaper. Mobutu used to have rallies, and he'd assemble all his officials, and then he'd announce who was fired. And Rex Tillerson found out he was no longer Secretary of State in 2018 by scrolling through Twitter while on the toilet. So the personalities, I'll talk about this with George, the personalities are remarkably the same. The outcomes are very different. Mobutu would send people to prison, but the dynamics and the chaotic political style of governance has not changed so much. So finally, I add to the authoritarian playbook by really highlighting the role of virility and how it works together with the other tools of rule. And many of these men gain favor after periods of great progress for women. And so there's a kind of turning back the clock, that they taking away anything that's going to threaten patriarchy. And they respond to anxieties about the eclipse of male heroism and male authority. But virility also enables corruption, and here's how they work together. Projecting the idea that the leader is above the law and he can kind of get away with things that weaker men or lesser men cannot get away with. So Trump's famous line, he said before he took office, "When you're a star, they let you do it," can be transposed to the political sphere because they have these heads of state have personality cults that glamorize them. They are the stars. They capture our attention 24/7, and they promote an ethos of macho lawlessness. And so I show in the book how this connects to violence, obviously, to corruption, and to propaganda. So getting away with it is part of their charm. So authoritarianism isn't just about following orders. Often it's the feeling of being thrilled that rule breaking is legitimized. And I'll stop there and take it over to you, George.
Yeah, I found the virility section of your book the most fascinating, not just because of what it told me about some of these leaders, that a lot of them were sexual abusers. Gaddafi basically ran a sexual slave operation And Mussolini was not much better. And of course, we have Donald Trump we know Donald Trump. But it was not just that commonality, because I mean, you can understand that in light of how these are men who view other human beings not as human beings, but as tools for their aggrandizement. But it's also, it binds their masculine pretensions, which aren't always masculine because they don't necessarily adhere to some aspects of traditional masculinity. It binds them to the populace that support, part of the populace that supports them. There, at one point, I think you make the point that they try to be the everyman man. At the same time, they are the Superman man who's above it all. And I think the idea is that people want that leadership or that control, but at the same time, they want to feel part of the greatness of the Superman. So they want that duality in a leader. So you have Putin, you describe as riding horseback with his shirt off, and at the same time being invincible and above the law, as you describe. How does that, tell us more about that? It's a fascinating and sick dynamic that we've frankly seen in the last 4 years here. I mean, not just with, but with Trump, yes, especially.
What's really interesting about personality cults, and we should never underestimate them, because sometimes they last after the leader has left office. The canons of the personality cult, the way they work, haven't really changed, even though the media through which they're disseminated, their images are disseminated, obviously is different. Mussolini had newsreels, and Hitler also, and today Bolsonaro and Trump use Twitter. So that's changed, but the kind of rules where they have to be an everyman, they have to be relatable. Many times they engage in crude humor, sexist humor, misogynistic humor, and there's a whole brand of crude jokes called Putinisms. Bolsonaro does the same thing. And they're also relatable in that they're very good at fashioning themselves as authentic. And one of the paradoxes of the book is, the more skilled they are at this mediatized politics, the more they seem authentic to people, right? So you're a man of the people, and Trump, with his carefully curated misspelled tweets, and all of the things he does, that's that. But they're also a man above all other men. And not only because of their hypermasculinity, and I did an article for the New Yorker on what happens when the strongman falls ill, which talked about Trump's miraculous recovery from COVID. But this isn't all about just images and propaganda. It connects to real social policy, because time and again, these men who are frequently the most profane individuals are the ones who are embraced by religious institutions. And this is why the man above all other men, they are courted, they are said to be ruling with divine benediction. And almost all of them have this kind of alliance with religious institutions. So Mussolini, who was a total atheist, sexual assaulter, he was an anti-clerical, he was the one who made the deal with the Vatican, up through Trump, who again is hardly a pious individual, who's been embraced by evangelical Christians and Orthodox Jews. So we have Secretary of State Pompeo saying that Trump has been put in office to save the nation. So the savior profile of these men is very, very important. And so Berlusconi called himself the Jesus Christ of Italian politics, because they're saviors, but they're also victims, because the cult of victimhood is also important. So all of these things recur over a century to a remarkable degree.
Hold on, I was on mute. What you just said triggers another passage in your book that really struck me. And it's about how these strongmen use a vision of utopianism and nostalgia. They create an image of a nation that was once perfect and better than it is today, and they contrast it with maybe self-created or a current perception or propagandistic description of crisis, so that they alone can save it. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, I added this chapter, and it's called A Greater Nation, about the myths of national greatness, and how they use ritual, and they kind of develop these communities based on these utopian, this kind of propagandistic idea that they're going to save the nation. They're the only ones who are anointed to bring it to greatness.
I alone can do it, right?
Yes. And so I talk about 3 time frames. So on the one hand, they traffic in utopia. So we're going to make a better future. And in doing that, to make this utopia work, they have to present the present as horrible. So when Trump had his inauguration speech and started talking about, America's like a rusted out wasteland, and nobody, former President Bush said, "This is really weird." He used a 4-letter word.
He said weird shit, yes.
He said, "This is weird shit." That's in my book, because this was abnormal speech for democracy, but totally normal for authoritarianism, so much so that Mussolini used to talk about this crisis. So they hold out utopia, but they also channel nostalgia, because it's not about making the nation great, it's making it great again. So all of them harken back to some mythical better past at the same time, right? They're doing this at the same time. So Mussolini had the Roman Empire. That was good and solid thing to base it on. Erdogan talks about the Ottoman Empire. Putin sometimes talks about the Russian Empire. They all have their thing they do. Trump has this kind of vague blend of 1950s and idea of when women, people of color, and workers knew their place. And this is huge, right? And this is his in also to all the people who are pro-Confederate, that the whole racial, white racial supremacy sector that he channels is about this utopia. So you have those kind of time frames, and they all do this. And then there's a third time frame, which is crisis, which is when they proclaim states of exception, when they use emergencies, whether the Reichstag fire or Erdogan, 2016, the coup attempt against him. And it opens up these crisis windows of exceptional actions. So these are all engaged in this project of kind of changing the nation and making it great again. I think you're muted, George.
I keep doing that.
It's okay.
Another aspect of your book that you touched upon a little bit tonight, and it would be great to hear more about, is corruption. And corruption, and not just financial corruption, but using the powers of the office or the government to help the strongman and his cronies, and also the nepotism. It strikes me, and at the same time, you point out that the strongmen are perceived as being pure and incorruptible. Hitler was incorruptible. And in fact, you point out, I think at one point in your book, that the term drain the swamp really didn't originate in the United States in 2016 or 2015. It was what was it in the original Italian, right? It was Mussolini talking about, he used that same phrase. And yet at the same time, they use the corruption as a means of control. At the same time, they rapaciously benefit from it because they want to acquire everything, control about everything. Tell us more.
So part of this everyman Superman is that all of them pose as kind of reformers, that they're going to clean up this terrible crisis-ridden present. And Mussolini was the first, and Mussolini gets a short shrift. We always think about Hitler for good reasons, but well before Hitler came to power, Mussolini had drafted a whole program of white racial rescue, of anti-corruption efforts, although he was highly corrupt. So the centerpiece of this was his idea of draining the swamps, which was literal. He was draining swamps outside of Rome and building these kind of very modern architecture new towns. But it also applied to cleaning up the mafia. So he posed as an anti-corruption reformer. And then, of course, co-opted the mafia's methods. And Hitler too, he kept saying, I don't take a salary, I'm a pure individual. But now we know, because there are books starting to come out on Nazi corruption, that he had the Gestapo destroy his tax records because he never paid any taxes. And the key, going back to the divide and rule thing, they succeed in putting themselves above everyone else so that anything that the people don't like can be blamed on their underlings. So there's a quote I have in the book from a secret police report, somebody saying, if Hitler only knew, you have the same thing, if Mussolini only knew what was going on, he would fix it. He's being cheated by his own people. So in that way, they remain kind of in their bubble. And that's often why by the end of a regime, all of their underlings can be hated, but they're still revered if they pull this off. So the corruption thing is at the heart of authoritarianism. And it goes along even those who destroy democracy totally, but also somebody like Berlusconi, who normalized corruption to an astonishing extent, so much so that he had dozens of, they're called ad personam laws that were about his personal financial and juridical situation. So if he was accused of bribery, he had a law passed that made bribery a lesser offense. And Berlusconi is it's a cautionary tale because he was in and out over a decade of the 2000s. And by the time he was gone in 2011, attitudes toward corruption and accountability and transparency in government had changed in Italy. So the book is also looking at the costs you don't have to be destroying democracy. You can keep a democracy and then still really tarnish and degrade the values that are bedrock values of democracy, of civil society, of ethics in government. So that's Berlusconi. He's a protagonist in the book, partly because of that.
Tell us more about the use of dividing the population, there's an inclusive aspect of the strongman's vision of the nation, which says, here are the good people, here are the people, the true Americans, in the case of Donald Trump, the patriotic Americans, or it could be Chileans, it could be Italians. And then there are the others. And the others could be foreigners or immigrants, they could be Jews, they could be the elite. How does that play into the strongman's playbook?
Well, it's absolutely fundamental. So they thrive on polarization to keep people apart and everyone dependent on them. But of course, they thrive on creating enemies. And this, again, the propaganda creates the enemies, but the enemies are also said to be corrupt. They're sucking the life out. Anxieties about borders. And I show that when Pinochet was trying to justify his coup, he had his officials trot out and say, we had tens of thousands of foreigners coming over the border. So this nexus between blaming foreigners and migrants for acts of criminality is very old. This is an old playbook. So much so that in 2015, the Trump campaign released a video that showed people running toward a border, and they were trying to pass it off as people coming from Mexico into the United States. It turned out it was a far-right Italian video because this propaganda circulates. So this is why in the propaganda chapter, you see that these tropes and these themes that are very effective in creating enemies, they get recycled. And then it relates to the violence chapter, because we see how the mechanisms of what to do with these people, Hitler and Mussolini had genocide. Erdogan has his political enemies, he has mass detention, right? Putin has many more people in penal colonies and prisons than is often talked about. He has Jehovah's Witnesses, just like the Nazis did. So there are groups of people from the nomads that Mussolini persecuted in the Saharan desert in the early 30s to Roma and Sinti people. So there are categories of people who I show in the book who are persecuted over and over again. People of non-normative sexuality, Jews, other Muslims, and so the techniques of violence may change, but the targets often remain the same.
And the connecting force is propaganda. You just talk a lot about propaganda, and the truth takes an enormous beating from strongmen. Sometimes it results in the shutting down of journalistic institutions. It can result in the assassination of journalists, like what Putin has done. And it can be the takeover of media institutions. Berlusconi owned them. Tell us about the importance of the suppression of truth, both in empowering strongmen and the propagation of lies and the empowering of strongmen, and then in the resistance to them, whether it be you talk about the White Rose, and you talk about the Catholic Church fighting back against Pinochet. Tell us about both sides of that, if you could.
So one of the many reasons that all of these strongmen go after the press, they go after them very early on, because they know that they could expose their crimes, because many of these men they come to power with criminal records, or they're under investigation. So Mussolini and Hitler had criminal records. Putin, Trump, and Berlusconi were under investigation, and they need to poison the idea of the press in the public's mind, because when they turn up evidence of their wrongdoing, they need the public to already believe that they're partisan hacks. So this is why Trump so early started with the fake news, and he started in his rallies. He had two basic, at the beginning he had anti-Muslim, he had his own political opponent, lock her up, and then he had the press. So this was just out of the playbook. But the propaganda chapter also shows how things have changed, because censorship has continued. But for example, in 1939, Mussolini passed an edict that said, you can't have any newspaper headlines with question marks, because meaning has to be locked down, right? Mussolini is always right, this kind of thing. But the playbook used now, which is pioneered in part by Putin, the political warfare, information warfare that Trump uses too, everything's a question mark. It's designed to confuse you, to throw all meaning, all notions of truth, out the window, to make the truth too exhausting to even search for anymore. And so you have conspiracy theories that are weaponized by the state. So that's a good example. So Mussolini didn't want any question marks in headlines. Putin has question marks around everything, with the exception of the figure of the leader. That's one of the few categories. So that connects back to the infallible
and now we
anchor.
had Trump and Bannon, what was the phrase that Bannon had for it?
Flooding
the zone with shit.
Flood the zone.
Yeah.
And so one of the points I make in the book is that we were not prepared for this. There are good reasons. We've never had a national dictatorship. We haven't had foreign occupation. But the people around Trump have a lot of experience with this authoritarian playbook. And when you start looking at how many people around him in 2016. So
Manafort.
Roger Stone and Manafort worked for Mobutu, who's in the book. They worked for Marcos. They were hired to oversee his fraudulent election. The whole misinformation tactics. And then, of course, we know Manafort worked for Putin, and that part is very well known. But Bannon, he worships Mussolini. He is devoting his life to the promotion of far-right politics around the world. So then the barrage of misinformation that Trump has unleashed and the techniques, they are unprecedented in American democracy, but they're normal. They're the inheritance of authoritarianism, past and present. So we were not prepared, and our media wasn't prepared. They took Trump on faith, on good faith, because we didn't have experience in anything else.
And that just reminds me of a quote toward the end of your book that really got to me, because it really, even though it's by Clyde Haberman, a journalist who spent decades with the New York Times. He was a reporter, he was an op-ed columnist, and he said this, he tweeted this, and you quote it toward the end of your book. He tweeted this in March 2020. Thinking this morning about my naivete in November 2016, we all knew that Trump was a hideous character, but I thought the presidency would change him, that he would be elevated by the office. Couldn't have been more wrong. And literally that was my attitude. I mean, Haberman and I would have different political views, but that was my attitude. Yeah, he's not great, he's bad, he's not the greatest guy in the world, but surely he will see this office is greater, that he has a duty to something greater than he is. He's accomplished a lot for himself, and he's going to want to preserve his legacy, and it will tame him. And nothing could have been more wrong. I wish I had read your piece that you described earlier in 2016, or I don't know, even if I read it, I probably wouldn't have believed it at the time. It took a few months, it took about a year for me to realize this guy is qualitatively different. He doesn't respect the rule of law. He only cares about himself. And that's how I began following you on Twitter. It's like, this guy is like these cretins in Europe, modern European history that I've read about. Tell us why didn't we understand this better as Americans?
You're not alone. One of the tragedies, and the book talks about this, is over and over, people are not prepared. Now, the Italians who went through this, they were the first people to go through this, and then the Germans, and there were people who were warning the Germans based on. But
people like me, I've read about Hitler, I've read about Mussolini, I know a lot about this stuff. I didn't see it.
We don't see it because it's our own reality. And in the conclusion, I talk about, it means you have to put aside these cherished national myths of exceptionalism. So the Chilean, I got quite chilled writing the Chilean parts, because their whole thing was, it can't happen here. One after another, their neighbors were falling to the US, often US-backed juntas. And they said, not us. Our army is wedded to democracy. And then it did happen. So and it happened fast because it was a coup. But over and over again, people are not prepared to see what's in front of them. And there's a mixture of denial. And because it's also, what are you going to do about it? It means you have to do something. It's also dismay. It's feeling desperation. And also optimism, that you think it's got to be, he's going to calm down. And I call this the Pivot Delusion. And this happened not just in Italy and Germany, which are well-known cases, but here's a very sad case I write about. Even when there's a coup, so in Chile, okay, the coup happened, US-backed. Now, I certainly don't discount the role that the US played, but I also focus on Chileans because I'm interested in these issues of what happens within a culture. And after the coup, the Christian Democrats, some of the leaders misread Pinochet. And they said there was a man who had been president, Eduardo Frei Montalva, and he said, Pinochet is going to restore order, get rid of the armed foreigners coming over the border, and then he's going to return Chile to democracy. Now, in this case, because Pinochet was the last to join the coup, and he had a history of kind of respecting the Constitution. He wasn't a far-right individual, although others around him doing the coup were. And so, of course, this didn't happen. And when Montalva realized what he was dealing with and began to speak out, Pinochet poisoned him. And he was one of the people who went into the hospital and never came out. It became dangerous to go into the hospital to have an operation because they would poison you. So this has happened over and over again. And when I say you're in good company, I just read part of the interview that Obama gave to Jeffrey Goldberg. And he said he was amazed at seeing how the GOP folded and caved in front of Trump.
Right, absolutely. I couldn't have imagined that.
But this too is part of the dynamic of the elites who they make their deals. They're called in political science authoritarian bargains, and they make their deals, and each one supports for their own reasons, perhaps. But they also think they can control this rabble rouser, this outsider, this extremist, and he's going to become normal. They'll bring him in the system, and then he'll become mainstreamed. And
Hindenburg
doesn't
thought that.
work. Yeah.
So one last question before we take the audience questions, and it relates to Berlusconi. And reading your book and reading all about Berlusconi, I've now learned more about Berlusconi than I had learned reading newspapers over the last 20 years. He really strikes me as the most similar to Donald Trump. And it's not just because he was this rich man who got himself elected as a populist, but it's because he lacked the tools to establish true authoritarian rule, even though he had these authoritarian tendencies. And that's just like Trump. In Italy and in the United States, knock on wood, here, the institutions did hold, even though there was no pivot, as you say. The rule, you know, we retained a free press that was critical and exposed the leader. The military didn't intervene or cave to the authoritarian as it did, say, in Chile or in Germany. And fundamentally, democracy survived, and the rule of law has survived, even though, but yet both Berlusconi and Trump did enormous damage. And Trump, God help us, what would have happened if Trump had gotten the 80 million votes instead of Joe Biden? So what lesson is there? I mean, do you agree that Berlusconi is the best analogy to our current situation? And what lesson is there from it? And do we have to worry that Trump might make a comeback the way Berlusconi did a couple of times?
Yeah, Berlusconi was voted out, and then he came back in 2 years later. So you can imagine the despair of people who, the similarities are astounding. Now, Trump is far more dangerous. He has nuclear weapons and everything we know. But the book starts with
Berlusconi and Putin, yeah.
Berlusconi had a special relationship with Putin, to the point they were very good friends. It was far more of a friendship than he has with Trump. And Berlusconi also was a real billionaire. He wasn't in enormous debt, although it's never been cleared up what his financial stakes in Russia were. But they vacationed everywhere together. But the secrecy that surrounded their relationship, for the foreign policy of Italy toward Russia, was taken over personally by Berlusconi and his envoys. And there was a Giuliani type figure, Valentino Valentini, who was fluent in Russian, who literally took care of Russian foreign policy and traveled to Russia once a month. And the foreign ministry was totally X'd out. They were totally in the dark. So one of the US ambassadors called Bellantini a bagman, Berlusconi's bagman with Putin. So there's that. And I talk about how Berlusconi ultimately lost credibility because as Putin became more and more extreme, Berlusconi had to take more extreme positions, more anti-American positions. And so it's it didn't serve him very well. But Berlusconi also, as I mentioned, corruption and passing all these ad personam laws. He owned television networks and he never resolved conflicts of interest. He had connections to organized crime. His right-hand man was convicted in 2004 of mafia association. On and on and on. He brought the neo-fascists into the government, the first European to do so, and mainstreamed extremism. So he detained migrants, one of the first in Europe to detain migrants in camps. So the template for the kind of authoritarian tending rule that we see in America was laid down by Berlusconi. And Berlusconi and Putin, and I said up in the introduction, have these two different paths. One all but destroys democracy. One never destroys democracy, but does a huge amount of damage to civil society and to ethics and to transparency.
Okay, let's go to the Q&A. Thank you for that, Ruth. We have a bunch of questions. I'll pick a few of them. If you want to add yours into the queue, please do, and I'll try to pick out the best ones for the next 15 minutes. Deborah Santor has this question. She says, 70 million people voted for Trump. Many of Trump's supporters do not even believe in the coronavirus, even as they are dying. Is it possible to break through to these people who have drunk the Kool-Aid? Because if we can't, our democracy is in trouble, even if Biden is inaugurated.
It's very difficult to do so, and I start the conclusion to the book by saying that even when they're gone, they remain as traces in the culture, and they remain as traces in people's minds and bodies. And I think that there's a temptation to say, okay, we don't have to think about Trump anymore. We can unfollow him. He's just golfing all the time. He didn't do so much damage. But I believe we must take what he accomplished seriously, first and foremost, besides his destruction of many institutions at the level of the civil service, but his personality cult. As you say, 70 plus million people voted for him despite his criminal mismanagement of the pandemic. And he's going to take those souls with him, whatever he is going to do. And so while he's still active, while he's still having a kind of a media domination in whatever form that's going to take, it's going to be hard to get through to them, partly because one of the foundational things is their victimhood. The cult of victimhood of Trump victimhood is a foundational thing of Trump culture, right? And being defeated and unfairly, right? Even when he eventually leaves, the election was rigged. His victimhood theme will be more lively than ever. So in the short term, it's going to be difficult to get through to people. Often, this is very sad. In Italy and Germany, and of course they're not analogous because there was one party state with state media for so long, but it's interesting that the only thing that made people start to publicly criticize the leader was getting bombed by the Allies. All the other hardships and things, the war had to come, they had to have concrete pain to you and your family before you realized that maybe the personality cult was fiction. So we do have all these stories of people about to be intubated who still believe that coronavirus is a hoax because Trump told them. But we'll see where that stands by January. And it's a very sad situation, right? But that is one way some people will cease to believe the fictions they've been taught.
Couple of questions that are kind of following up to that is, well, what as citizens can we do to, we obviously have to take Trump seriously and the residue of Trump seriously. and I'm paraphrasing a couple of questions here. Well, what as citizens can we do to ensure that we don't have an authoritarian tending leader in the future?
So despite having just said that about the durability of the Trump cult, I do believe that bridge building is important. And I do end the book with, and this is not about saying we're going to put aside or forgive racists who have, shot at your son. This is about trying to find some kind of common ground with other people, and having a sense of national unity. It's going to be difficult in the short term. I also believe in civic education, and these are big scale projects of teaching people, which is being done in other countries, teaching children to recognize disinformation, but also modeling, and this can be done immediately, modeling a different vision of government with people of color in power, because Trump's waged this psychological warfare, having these crowds of white men in power. And so modeling different behavior in terms of ethics. There's a lot that can be done at the level of shifting the political culture, learning, and this has been a huge wake-up call for many people. And that is something that we can learn from. It's the making lemonade out of lemons. There's many people have been realized their rights are a lot more fragile, and our democratic values are more fragile, and they can't be taken for granted.
Question from an anonymous attendee. What does history suggest about how the next 67 or so days will play out?
So what is going on now is entirely predictable. It's part of what authoritarians do. They, in fact, sadly, since I started writing the book, Orban now rules by decree. Putin has changed the Russian constitution. It's very, I think in 2019, I was on Chris Hayes' show, and I said, once they get into power, it's very difficult to get them out. So I'm not using the word coup. I think that they're doing everything possible to remain in office, because be it William Barr, be it Pompeo, be it all the kind of power configurations, they've invested an awful lot in their agendas, and I believe that they would have consolidated these anti-democratic agendas in a second term, and so they don't want to give that up. They're losing a lot. But to have a coup, he would have to have the law enforcement and the military on his side. And although we saw this summer how infiltrated those sectors are with extremist ideologies, white supremacy, it's very significant that the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, went out of his way to make a declaration that and I thought of Chile, of course, the armed forces it adheres to the Constitution, not an individual. That was a very pointed remark. So I don't think he's going to pull off any kind of coup. The danger is that he will try and do as much damage as he can, both sabotaging the Biden administration. He wants Biden to have an impossible situation.
And I think about the Nero decree, decree, when I say that,
they blame their people. If they can't have power, no one can have power. And because they don't care about the nation and they only care about power, indeed, they despise the people they govern. They actively despise them. They have no compunction.
There's this scene out of the movie Downfall. That's based upon Albert Speer's account of the final days in the bunker, where Hitler is basically, the German people don't deserve to live.
Yeah.
He did that's why he ordered Speer to destroy everything, and Speer disobeyed the orders, he said.
And you see, Yeah, and the endings chapter was so interesting to write, dismaying, because you see that, and also Gaddafi, he'd rather drag Libya into civil war than leave. He would never surrender. And they end up, in these sieges, these states of siege, in their bunkers and their palaces and their compounds. Ironically, they watch each other's ends very carefully. So one of the reasons Putin, did his crackdown in 2012, he got very scared about Arab Spring. And he watched, an associate of his said he watched obsessively these scenes of Gaddafi getting pulled out of.
And Hitler wanted to rescue Mussolini, didn't he? I mean, I don't know if this is your book, but
yes.
I think I've read that.
And Hitler actually didn't want to end up like Mussolini, being a spectacle.
Which is why he killed himself.
Right. So they get influenced by each other. But one thing they have in common is that they are extremely dangerous when they're threatened, and they're highly destructive, and they will do anything it takes to ruin it for everybody else and for the next ruler, the next leader.
Yeah. All right, so 3 questions I'm going to string together because they seem quite related. Patricia Hahn asks, Gaddafi was a narcissist, as is Trump. Is that a universally applicable personality trait to modern authoritarians? Another question by Joseph Marusa. How did Trump develop all these strongman skills? And then another related question by Edward Bedrick. Does an authoritarian figure act out of instinct, or does he or she know what they're doing? You see how those questions relate. I'm wondering what your reaction is to them.
So the latter two together, one of the things that we, again, if we believe their glorified histories that they spin with their American PR firms and their personality cults, that they're genius, they're genius strategists, and that they have a master plan for everything. And instead, although they watch each other, they are not, certainly not Trump, who doesn't read. He's different from all other leaders because he doesn't read. Berlusconi read.
Yeah.
They are going on instinct. They're opportunists. And because they're amoral and ruthless characters who will use and discard anyone and anything, they are supreme at taking opportunities when they present themselves. They will partner with anyone. That goes back to like Trump and the evangelicals. Like one might not have seen that coming in some ways based on Trump's past. And so they maneuver themselves into positions of power, and then they know how to humiliate, bully, blackmail, whatever needs to be done to stay there. And so from that, we can get to their personality. One of the most horrifying things about the book is that the outcomes are different, right? The fascist era is different, and I really try as a historian to respect these times and places. But their personalities and their traits of their temperament are the same. They're all quite the same. And you can put in a quote about one of them, like about Mobutu, that he was, obsessively concerned with any slights to his person. Again, I mentioned the humiliating others by firing them in public. The behaviors are the same. And the secret of the strongmen is that they're weak and they're afraid, right? So in the conclusion, I talk about how fear manifests, and again, they puff themselves up. They try and bully people to seem infallible, but they're afraid because for Democratic presidents, leaving office is a chance to move on and build on their legacy. For authoritarians, it's a psychological eclipse. It's like an annihilation. They can't conceive of not being in the pole position, in the center of power, and that's why they get destructive.
Okay, a question from Ian Perone, which really I think in a lot of ways you've already answered, because you've talked about the opportunism of strongmen, but I think it's a great question anyway, and will enable you to expand upon it. I recently finished Tim Alberta's American Carnage.
Mm-hmm.
The author essentially argues that the conditions for a strongman like Trump to try and destroy democracy were already in place, and he, Trump, merely was, quote, in the right place at the right time, close quote, so to speak. Do strongmen generally take advantage of existing conditions, or do they warp the socioeconomic conditions in a country to suit their aims?
It's a little of both. It's a bit of a chicken and egg question, but over and over, these individuals, they find favor because there's already a need within this culture. And what they're able to do, because they're charismatic and they know how to manipulate people and become these leader cults, they are able to channel and focus existing anti-democratic and extremist tendencies. And so they form movements. It's very important that Trump's was a movement and that he made this tribe with the hats, right? People want to have an insignia. So he gave a focus and a momentum to things that were already going on. But one of the hard truths we need to take seriously is the GOP, in my opinion, is an authoritarian party. It stopped a long time ago respecting the idea of bipartisan government and mutual tolerance, where you may not agree with your, opponent, but you're not saying lock her up.
Right.
And they were already on this journey. And then what happens is these guys come in and kind of supercharge this. And so he kind of completed their transformation in a certain way, but there's always a kind of political earthquake that happens. And so you've had within the Republican Party, many people leaving, never Trumpers and other factions who leave. And so an earthquake is good, or a volcano, because the landscape is not the same in their wake. So I agree with Alberta, and we have to take this seriously because this isn't going away. We may get rid of Trump, but the conditions that he satisfied and he energized are not going away.
All right. So as our final question, I'm going to take two questions. We're
Maybe
almost out of
end
time.
on a happier note.
Well, I don't know. Well, I don't know if it's some people might think it's a happier note. I'm going to take two questions and then rephrase them into a question of my own. David Bigler writes, should we be concerned with Biden's current approach to being status quo and conciliatory to what Trump is doing now? And then an anonymous attendee says, should we make a deal with Trump? And I'm going to pose the question this way. We have a president who unquestionably has serious legal issues. He has, if you look at the Mueller report, there's the elements of obstruction of justice were met. The Ukraine matter was something that if a governor of a state had done that with highway funds, would have triggered an immediate federal grand jury investigation in prosecution. We have a man who has tax issues. We have a man who, according to the United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York, directed his lawyer, fixer Michael Cohen, to commit campaign finance fraud, a criminal violation. And then you describe in your book Mr. Berlusconi, who ultimately was brought to justice, although he didn't end up serving a sentence because he was over 7 years old, and under the Italian law, he couldn't be imprisoned, although he did some community service. Putting all that together, what do we do with Trump? You talk about reaching out to the Trumpists, his supporters, and that's what Joe Biden is also talking about, trying to build bridges. But does that mean that we let the rule of law go and we suspend its application to Donald Trump because it's just not worth, the game isn't worth the candle?
No, absolutely. And that sends the wrong message. I don't believe he should be pardoned. That would be a disaster. And one of the lessons of Berlusconi is when he was voted out in 2006, the center left came in, and this was like a golden opportunity to pass laws that were tougher on corruption and all of the problems that had beset Italian society for 5 years. Because what happens is that these rulers expose all of the weaknesses in the system, all of the loopholes. And Trump's whole modus operandi has always been to expose regulatory, financial, legal loopholes. And he brought this into government. But the center left didn't do any of this. They hardly passed any anti-corruption measures. And this is why they made a big mistake. And from this was born a lot of populism in Italy. Italy's always ahead of everybody else. First fascists and Beppe Grillo and the Five Star Movement. It was born in this climate because there was so much anger that they weren't doing anything to address the problems. And so what happens? They didn't push back firmly, and Berlusconi came back in, and he was more corrupt than ever. So that's one lesson. You have to push back, but you don't have to. I think that Biden right now, calmness, decency is very important because, again, we haven't even, I think we haven't begun because we can't. He's still there, creating crises every day. We haven't begun to assess the damage he's done. We're also, many people are exhausted.
Yeah.
So having calmness and decency and conciliatory talk is what people need right now.
But the legal process should be allowed to go in on independently.
Absolutely. If it's not done, it's sending a message to future people who, and it's also letting people like Barr, who have politicized and personalized justice, it's sending them the message that they can get, if they get back into power, they can do whatever they want. It's really a crucial window that we have here.
Thank you so much, Ruth. This has been just a wonderful discussion. I think our hosts have a concluding segment here. They want to ask us questions and encourage people to buy your book, which they should, and I would encourage them to do that. It's a great book.
Thank you.
Look at all the dog-eared pages I have.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Conway. Before we do go, I wanted to ask both of you a question that we ask all of our participants, and that is there anything you're currently reading? And if so, could you please share that with our audience? So
I'm reading this novel, which is shortlisted for the Booker Prize by an American Ethiopian author, Maza Mengistu, The Shadow King, which is about female resistance to when Mussolini invaded Ethiopia. And it's a historical fiction.
And I've been reading this great book that I bought at the Connecticut Avenue store, published by Lawfare Press, their first publication of the website Lawfare. And it's a book by Bob Bauer, former Obama White House counsel, and Jack Goldsmith, who served as an assistant attorney general during the George W. Bush administration. And it's called After Trump. And it's a book, it's a lawyer's book in a way, but I think it's accessible to anybody with a strong interest in government. It's about what do we do to fix all the loopholes, as Ruth described it, and the problems that Trump has identified. What do you do when somebody is, a president is ready to violate the law and violate the norms that his predecessors have abided by? What modifications to the law can we make, and modifications to the system can we make to make sure that a Donald Trump can't do the things that he has done over the last 4 years, if we ever, God forbid, get another one.
Well, thank you both very much for this wonderful discussion. Of course, thank you everyone who's taken time out of your evening to tune in. Hopefully everyone will see you again, so to speak, for another PNP Live. Wish everybody a good day and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.